coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government. I'm Danno Lemu, a graduate student at Harvard Business School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and your special guest host for this episode of GovLove. GovLove is produced by ELGL, the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network, and you can support GovLove by becoming an ELGL member. Individual memberships are just $50 per year and give you access to incredible events, networking, and professional resources. Visit elgl.org to learn more about individual and organizational membership options. This episode is the latest entry in our Between Two Interns series, which gives younger leaders like myself a platform to interview and speak with individuals tackling big issues in local government. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Sam Quinney, the director of the lab at DC, and Ryan Flynn, a Civic Design Researcher also at the lab at DC. The lab is a team that sits within DC government and under the Office of the City Administrator. They use scientific insights and analysis to test and improve district policies and provide timely, relevant, and high-quality analysis to inform the important decisions made by city agency leaders. Our conversation today will focus a bit on Sam and Ryan's background, what brought them to the lab, the unique work they do for DC, and the recent efforts to improve the district's housing choice voucher program. Sam and Ryan, welcome to GovLove.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Danno.
Great to be here, Danno.
So before we start our formal interview, it's tradition on GovLove to begin each episode with a quick lightning round so we can get to know our guests better. Sam, I'll start with you. What's your most controversial, non-political opinion?
This one will be familiar to folks in the lab, or at least who have been there for a long time. But I don't believe that chocolate belongs in muffins or banana bread. And I think if you're anywhere in the realm of that, you're creating a cake or a cupcake. And chocolate is good on its own, but it doesn't belong in there.
I have a controversial response to your controversial opinion, Sam. I don't think chocolate belongs in anything. It shouldn't be period. Wow. I have like a physical aversion to chocolate, which is maybe a sad fact for myself. But that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Ryan, what about yourself?
I can handle the other side of coffee time with my controversial take, which is that the best coffee, even in January, is iced and decaf. And I've made a lot of enemies around the lab for that as well. Also, I'm very surprised to be the only person on the chocolate and muffins side of the ledger among the three of us.
Yeah, I'm sure you are, and I'm sure many of our guests are as well. But I respect the decaf option. I don't know about the iced option, but I respect the decaf option. Okay. Next question for you both, and Ryan, we'll start with you this time. You both are live in DC currently. What's your favorite part about living in the district?
Well, it changes. Right now, I want to name a place. There's the Metropolitan Branch Trail, which is a bike and walking trail that runs from a little bit north of the Capitol, almost up to the northern border of the district. And it skirts rail yards and like industrial property on one side, and then there's a mix of neighborhoods, new and old, on the other. And it's how I get to work or to daycare most days. And it is also almost a wonderful community in and of itself. Even in January, when I'm drinking my decaf iced coffee, if I'm out running at 7 or 8 at night, it's dark, there's still people there, and you start to see the same people. And it really connects different parts of the city in a way that makes living in one area, working in another, really accessible. So the combination of community and accessibility is something I just really appreciate about the trail. I didn't realize it was going to be such a big part of my life when I moved to the neighborhood I'm in now, but it really is.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to describe it. Sam, what about you?
Let's see. I second Ryan's endorsement of the MBT, and have something similar, which is that I think that my favorite thing about DC is DC in the spring, which is right now, where I grew up in the North East and have lived in some cold places, so like winter isn't the same in DC, but it still feels like winter. We lose leaves on the trees and stuff gets a little bit dead and brown.
Mm-hmm.
But spring in DC is just incredible, where you still get that like reemergence from the winter, starting with like the cherry blossoms in March, increasingly earlier in March, unfortunately. But then as you like progress through this spring, you get the city just kind of reaches its full height of beauty, I think, where you get lots of flowers, huge canopies of trees, and it's all over the city, in different places, and the city's really set up to access it, whether you're doing it on bike or walking or taking the metro. There's just a lot of wonderful outdoors things to see, even in a very compact urban area, and so I think that's the thing I like the most.
Yeah, the cherry blossoms come out to, just yeah, I fully agree. And then it starts to fall off in the summer.
Yes, then it gets
insanely humid. Great. Well, thank you both for those great responses. Now, I would love if we could start with hearing a bit more about your professional journeys and how you both ended up at a place like the lab. Ryan, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Well, I'm a civic design researcher, and I come to design with a bit of a wayward path. I started my career in international development finance, and didn't go to college realizing that that was what I wanted to do, but spent a fair amount of time during and just after college living in other countries, and had a set of experiences that sort of made something click for me about all the structural advantages that growing up in the United States provided me. And I became really sort of fascinated and troubled by how someone born where I was born could benefit from all the resources and privilege that I did, and how through the common musing of through no accident or anyone else's, other people didn't have that. And I thought, well, I want to solve that. And so I ended up doing graduate school work in social sciences with a focus on international development policy, and worked for several years after that at the World Bank, starting in a research role, doing qualitative research related to trying to understand what made systems for workforce development or for giving people the skills they need to succeed in jobs work across countries, and then moved into lending operations, which is what most people think of when they think of the World Bank, and then finally into another set of projects related to more advisory services to government leaders. And through the course of that work, two seeds were really planted for me. One around the methods that I now use, and the other around the really high bar there is when you're doing that type of work, where you're providing policy advice and money to other governments and to impact people and systems you don't understand. The really high bar there is for responsibility and humility in that work. And I came to believe that I couldn't really live up to that charge day to day. It was just a little bit too out of my wheelhouse culturally, and in terms of the scale of the power I wielded and the impact that would eventually have, that I couldn't fully understand. And so I decided after some time to go and work in advocacy back in Massachusetts, where I grew up. And that was a chance to learn the political side of policy, and also to do something in a community that felt more my own. And so I was working in education advocacy, and one of the things that I was in charge of as director of policy at a relatively small nonprofit was to do the research that would drive our advocacy with the legislature, either by doing it myself or convening others to get behind an agenda. And the beauty of that work is that you really got to understand how legislators thought, and you really got to understand how communities come together to build a policy agenda. But oftentimes, you just didn't really have much of an audience with government, and when you wanted data, it was really difficult. And I thought after some time that, well, I'm pushing on these problems from the outside. I'd love to see what the view from the inside in local government looked like. And so I started to look around for those opportunities. And I'd lived in DC before. I really loved it. When an opportunity with the lab at DC opened up, I thought, oh, what the heck? And luckily, they took a chance on me as well. And part of what appealed with this job is the chance to use some techniques that I had worked on and honed at the World Bank related to qualitative research, related to bringing groups together to identify, define problems, and then to think of like small, interesting ways to test that before you go live. That's part of my work now. The chance to do that again really appealed to me, and so my job now gives a chance to work within methods that involve really trying to understand what residents want and need from government, and then testing if our approaches are worthwhile through design methods and through some of the other specialties that the lab has.
That's awesome. Yeah, super impressive background, Ryan. Thank you. Sam, what about you?
So, Ryan, I'd note that that we're lucky as a team that you took a chance on us as well. I think when we were recruiting you had to pull over at the side of the road on like a road trip to see family to talk about the job, and I was like, oh, that's dedication. Maybe we've got a shot here. So very glad that your path took you to the lab as well. Mine, I think, at least my motivation takes on a similar vein for what Ryan described in terms of what brought me here. I mentioned I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in Vermont, which we have lots of local governments, but is decidedly not an urban area at all. And but really. What I remember thinking, and I've spent enough time with psychologists to know that what you remember is not necessarily what happened, but it's more how you construct meaning from your memories. But what I remember feeling towards the end of high school and when I was thinking about what I wanted to do with my life and thinking that you could decide that sort of thing in high school, and where I would go to college is that I felt like, similar to what Ryan mentioned, that a lot of what I was fortunate to have in my childhood, in the high school that I went to, and where I lived, wasn't a function of me or anything special about me, but just that I was lucky to be born where I was, to the family that I was born into, but nothing. There was nothing particularly special about what I could or couldn't do, and that really made me think about what I could do in my career to create opportunities for people, and to try and equalize those opportunities for no matter where you're born in the United States. And so I remember having that kind of feeling early on that guided me at different times during my career. But I actually went to college to become a journalist, and I really wanted to do like long form magazine journalism, and I viewed that as like something where I very much enjoyed writing, and I thought I was decent at it. But when I would work with my peers at the time in high school, who were also writers, and we would work on short stories or other things like that. I would read their stuff and I would read mine, and I'd think like, I don't really have a lot to say here. Like, they have something to say or a point that they're trying to make. But I didn't. So I realized that it would be much more useful to me to go into something more descriptive like journalism rather than creative writing or anything like that. But that's what I originally went to college for. But over time, I started to explore different parts of different courses in college, and had a really impactful course on public policy, where the professor in it his name was Bob Moranto, really got into looking at policy and the effectiveness of what it had, and also the unintended consequences of different policies. And I hadn't thought of it that way in terms of like what we were really trying to accomplish when a government puts out a policy, or when we were trying to do it, and why they might work out and why they might backfire. And so that was really my first exposure to public policy, and kind of thinking about it in a different way, and thinking about it in a quantifiable way. But I still had that urge to help people and help communities, and create opportunities. And so after college, that took me into teaching through Teach for America in Philadelphia, which I kind of got into because I wanted to help, but I also thought that teaching would probably be the hardest thing I could do, other than maybe like joining the military or the police force or something like that, which I had no interest in. And so it was kind of like wanting to do something and creating and having a desire for a challenge. And that proved to be a really important experience in my career, because I learned leadership and management and some systems thinking, but also kind of set me on a path to work in education for the early years of my career. And so I went from being a teacher to working for a organization that helped first generation college students, or first generation to college students, from Philadelphia, who were in high school, help them prepare for their college journey. And then the organization also worked with them through college. And that organization was called Philadelphia Futures. And so was really fortunate to do that afterwards, because it got me into a different perspective in education. But throughout all of it, whether I was in the classroom or working through college things, I kind of had this bug that was thinking about, why are we doing the things that we're doing, and are they actually working? And when I saw things in the classroom, when I saw things in the kind of college guidance system or college application system, like, it occurred to me that a lot of these things, like, we really don't know if this is the right way to approach it. I thought about when I was teaching in a classroom, or in some of the extracurricular work that we did at Philadelphia Futures. I got a lot of active feedback on like whether I did something right or wrong. The kids kind of told me about it in one way or another, and got that response, but we didn't get that systemically in education. And so that's what motivated me to go to grad school, and brought me on this path towards thinking about how we use evidence in policy, and learning how to generate it. And so was really fortunate to work in the city of Chicago when I was there through a fellowship. And then after grad school, was able to go to the U.S. Department of Education through a presidential management fellowship, and kind of bring both my experience in education with some of the skills that I'd learned in grad school, which was around program evaluation and quantitative analysis. That time gave me a good view of how evidence is used or not used in the policymaking process, and also gave me even more of an itch to say, like, we don't know a lot about what actually works. So if the Secretary of Education at the time had wandered down to my cubicle and asked me, like, Sam, what should we do about our education system, I would only have like a handful of things that I could be confident in actually working. And so I kind of developed this desire to be in a place where we could test more things, we could learn about what's working and not working, and really inform those decisions, and figure out how we solve these big, somewhat seemingly intractable problems, like inequalities in our education system. And thankfully for me, was fortunate enough to find two places that would teach me how to do that. And the first was while I was still at the Department of Education, I was able to do what's called a rotation, which is like a 5 to 6 month stint in a startup team, which was the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team in the Obama administration. And that was where I got this just kind of like eye-opening, mind-blowing experience of like both how you can test things out in government and use rigorous methods, and also how you can convince people that that's okay to do it, and it's okay to try things and learn from them. And that work there eventually led me to DC government when the lab at DC was getting started up, and learning how to do that at a local level.
Awesome. You teed me up perfectly, Sam, with that. Would love to hear a bit more about the work of the lab, maybe a bit more about how it was started and what you all currently do for the city. I give a very brief introduction at the start in terms of your work, but I think a more thorough description would be helpful for our listeners.
Absolutely. And I think, as I imagine comes up in a podcast about local government and government in general, is that it often comes down to people. And it often comes down to opportunity and circumstance and things that aren't necessarily linear or within your control, but kind of all come together. And sometimes they come together in great ways. And I feel like the lab at DC is an example of that. And so there's a lot of people who are involved in the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team that were also really crucial in starting up the lab at DC. And so that was one of them was Kevin Donahue, who is currently our city administrator. But at the time, he was working in the General Services Administration and with the Office of Management and Budget. And when they're starting up this applied scientific team in the federal government, so the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. So if folks are familiar with either the book Nudge by Cass Sunstein and Dick Taylor, or the Behavioral Insights team in the UK government, it was modeled after these principles of using behavioral science to be able to improve government programs, but really importantly, test them out, and often using randomized experiments to say, okay, we can send this letter to a taxpayer or this other letter, and we don't need to just send one. We can actually split things up randomly and figure out what is, for example, better at prompting people to pay their taxes accurately. And so the people there were really important in doing that. And Kevin was very important in overseeing the growth and development of that team. And so the things that are just kind of circumstance and happenstance is that when Mayor Bowser was elected in 2015, or inaugurated in 2015 to be the mayor of Washington, D.C., she asked Kevin to be her deputy city administrator and deputy mayor for public safety and justice. And this idea that you can bring science into government and you can bring methods of testing policies out into government was one of the things that he decided to bring with him. And then he also started to bring people. And so two of the people that were really important in the federal government, David Yoakum and Kelly Bidwell, kind of came over with him on a part-time detail to figure out how this might work in local government as opposed to the federal government, and started to flesh out this idea of what the lab at DC could be and what might work well at a local level, and starting to work on projects, kind of figure out where the appetite was. And at the same time, or kind of along that path, I was looking for something different in my career. And they had, in what's probably common in a lot of like government startups, they convinced someone to make a position in our city administrator's office devoted to the startup of the lab, but it would have nothing in the position description in any way relevant to actually starting up a applied scientific team, but that I had to kind of apply to it and just trust that this was going to be what they said it was going to be. And so I did that, and that was a great decision for me and for my career. And so that was in 2016 when we first got kind of all the approvals and started to try and put the team together. So that's probably a longer origin story than you're looking for, but I'm happy I can talk about how we evolved, if that's from that point 8 years or so ago, if it's useful.
That would be helpful. And then afterwards, we could dive a bit more into the entire premise of evidence-based policymaking that the lab sort of is a part of.
Great, yeah. So what we set out to do and what we have done are not entirely different things, but it's really a path of evolution of the team and figuring out what is going to be most useful for DC government, and I think that's really important in understanding the lab and our orientation. Broadly, what we're trying to do is help inform decision making. And that can be decision making at any level of government. It can be at the level of a program in terms of how they decide to serve clients. It can be at the level of the resident themselves in terms of deciding what programs to apply for or whether they're eligible for something, all the way up to the city administrator and the mayor in terms of deciding, okay, we have, literally millions and billions of dollars in the DC government. How do we allocate it to the things that are going to be best for our residents, who are going to best make use of the resources that we have? But it's really oriented around that decision making, and everything kind of falls from there. Is if we can inform a decision better, that's going to lead to a better outcome for our residents. That's where we want to be working. Yep. So in those early years, we were kind of trying to both draw from what we used at the social and behavioral sciences team, which is focusing on how we can kind of make smaller things better. So for example, we might be focused more on figuring out which types of letters might be better to get people to recertify for their public benefits. And at that time, we were really focusing on what's the proof of concept. How can we're new, people don't necessarily know about us. We're trying to approach government a little bit differently. How do we get some proof points, and how do we get really some credibility that like you can do this work? So we were kind of looking for any opportunity we could to just demonstrate that you can do evaluation in government, and it doesn't need to be costly. It doesn't need to be time consuming, but it can still be relevant. And that led us in some different places, and a lot of dead ends in different areas, and a lot of really small projects that we used to demonstrate it. So I think even like the first project we were fully completed on was literally an email experiment where one of our regulatory offices was having trouble getting architects to show up to meetings where they had to review like blueprints for the designs of whatever they were building. Mm-hmm. So we were testing out whether if you send an email, one email versus another email, if they're more likely to show up for it. And I think maybe we could get them to show up like maybe a little bit more, but like this very small scale things, but trying to say it's like, this is how you can make this work for the most part. But over time, we've been able to transition to thinking about bigger and bigger projects and bigger and bigger programs, but applying that same methodology, which is to say, even if you're sending an email to architects, you don't need to choose one way of doing it, or you don't need to choose something that's going to persist forever. You can actually test out something for a short period of time, or you can test out multiple options of things. And so that's where we've grown in our portfolio of program evaluation work, is that we still do some of these tests of should you send this letter or this email or another one. But now we're also doing evaluations of programs like in DC, our Career Mobility Action program, which I won't get into a ton of detail on, but is the budget of it is millions and millions of dollars a year, and the outcome of it is really to literally bring people from experiencing homelessness in the district to earning a middle class, self-sustaining wage. So these both huge investments and huge goals of programs, and we're applying the same approach to it, which is to set it up in a way that we can test it. But over time, that work has branched out into a lot of different areas. But we've started to settle on kind of three things that we are able to do. One of it is still that program evaluation work, but the other parts of it have been our data science work and our civic design work. And I'll start with our data science work because I think we're going to have an example, a really great example of our civic design work later. But in our data science work, we try to recognize that there's a lot of data that a government uses or has, but doesn't necessarily use as well as it could. And so our data science team tries to take data that we already collect in the district, so in the field we call administrative data, and use it or combine it in different ways so that we can target what we're doing to the people or places that are going to most likely to benefit from it. So we've used this approach to try and predict in the district where we're going to find rats. If we send out rodent inspectors, we've used it to try and predict whether students are going to be more likely to be absent from school, or whether drivers who get certain patterns of tickets when they're driving are more or less likely to get into a crash. But trying to apply these same approaches to say, it's like, okay, let's use our data to make smarter decisions about how we apply our programs and how we use our resources. And then the other team that's really evolved over time is our civic design team, which is really focused on the ways that our residents interact with our government. And so that can be a small thing like an email, like a letter, or like a form, or it can be a large thing like a program, like a full program. But really, the idea is that when we're doing something as a government, we need to bring all of the users into the process of designing it and really try and make it work for the people who are going to be both using a program, but also running a program. So both the residents that are using a program or service, but also the frontline staff, the managers, the other parties that are going to be involved in it.
It's great. And I think a large share of our conversation after this point is going to focus a bit on that resident-centered design sort of programs that you all run. I'm curious, why do you all think it's important to bring all those stakeholders to the table when shaping programs and policies? Intuitively for me, obviously it makes sense. If people are being affected by the issue, they should have or are being affected by a service, they should have a say in how that service is meeting their needs. But I'm curious how you all sort of frame and support that argument.
Well, I can start, and then I'd love Ryan as the expert in this area to come in, and I'll kind of speak as kind of the evolution of the team. So something that might be obvious to other people, maybe wasn't as obvious to us at the beginning, and we came to this approach actually starting with this idea of using behavioral science and psychology to improve programs and services, but originally the idea was that we should take the view of our programs of, okay, how would either a behavioral economist or a psychologist look at the process of, for example, applying for public benefits, and do what we would call a behavioral audit of it, which is to look through everything and say, okay, I know from psychology or behavioral economics that this thing is going to cause an issue. It's going to cause a bottleneck, so we're providing too much information or choice overload to someone, and that's going to cause a problem for it. And we started coming at it from that angle. But what we started to realize over time is that that a lot of the time, if you can bring in the users of a program, they can really provide both what you might they can provide a perspective that uncovers those things for you in a lot of ways. And so you can kind of blend together what we know from behavioral science with just talking to people and observing them and asking questions and listening to what they're experiencing when they're trying to, for example, apply for a program or service. And so it's this nice blend of both science and things that are much more personal and organic and observational, where you can just go out to talk to people and understand what's important to them. And from a government's perspective, I think it's hugely important because even if you think that government should be completely top down and you put smart people in place to make the decisions for the public, which is not a view that I hold, but as I think more of a traditional view of government, even if you were to hold that, the great thing about involving your users in it, in what you're doing, is it helps you uncover all of the mistakes or glitches that you have in a process or a system. Because even if you don't really value designing things around residents, you do value being able to deliver on whatever the priorities of your government are. And so it's really been something where it serves so many great purposes for a government to be able to do that and to be able to engage in work like our civic design team does.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great justification. Well, I would love to hear more from you, Ryan, about the work you all are currently doing or have currently sort of led around the city's housing choice voucher program and how you've applied this resident-centered design framework to improve the city's voucher program.
HCVP is the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or is formerly known as Section 8 vouchers. And it is a federal program that provides a permanent subsidy for folks and families who have been unhoused to be able to afford a stable place to live. It's one of several voucher types that are available to district residents. Another major one is called LRSP, or the Local Rent Supplement Program, which is similar in a lot of ways to HCVP, but funded with local district dollars. And because of that, the district government exercises more control programmatically over how those funds are spent and what the requirements are. And as a result of the pandemic, district government decided to fund a large expansion in the number of local vouchers, and the thousands of extra vouchers. And while great in terms of its investment in reducing homelessness, it posed implementation challenges because the current process for folks to apply and for a voucher be approved, go and find housing and then actually lease up and end up in their own home is longer than anyone in district government intends. And so our two partners for the project, the Department of Human Services and the District Housing Authority, approached us to talk about ways where we might make the process easier and more streamlined and hopefully quicker for folks as a way to deal with the large number of applications that we're going to be going through the system. And so we started with a fairly tailored goal of trying to revise the application forms that are used to determine eligibility as a way to, in a small way, improve that process and the ability to process applications. And then from there, we, as I'll say in a minute, the project scoped out further. And so essentially the task was a form revision. And our team started by working with our partners at DHS and the Housing Authority to simply understand the universe of paper. And we pulled back over 100 different forms that are used at some point in the process, from inviting someone to apply through to determining eligibility, and ended up focusing on 44 forms, or pages rather, that were used directly in the application process. And that form was really an amalgamation of two different forms that were used to be used at separate times in the process, has been collapsed. So there was an awful lot of repetition. There's also a lot of legalese, and we found through watching case managers and residents use the forms that there was a lot of opportunity for wasted time, for confusion, and for errors, which ultimately ended up delaying the process. And so we approached the problem two ways. The first is that we spent a lot of time watching people fill out the form, as I just mentioned. The second was that we formed a team with our partners in the Housing Authority and DHS from the programmatic side and also the legal side to really go line by line through every page of the form to understand why exactly we were asking each question with the goal of cutting things where we could and simplifying and explaining where our time with residents and case managers showed that there was misunderstanding or confusion or discomfort. That resulted in a form that was reduced by about a third in terms of its length, and also split into two pieces. One was a core application that everyone who would apply for a voucher filled out that had information that was needed across all the programs. The other was a supplement that was either focused specifically on the local LRSP program or the federal HCVP program, which had different information requirements. And that way, everyone had an application form and experience that was tailored to the particular information needs needed to determine eligibility for their specific voucher. We did a lot of other things too to try to make the application more welcoming, easier to use, more forgiving of mistakes or misunderstandings, including really simplifying the language from what was an average of about a grade 8 reading level down to a reading level of grade 4, adding explainers where we knew people were having questions or not sure how to proceed, and trying to use logic where we could to allow people to skip sections of the form. Like for instance, instead of asking 5 or 6 questions about folks' assets, many of which very few people had, you could ask one question, which is, do you have assets above the threshold of $15,000 whereby we need more detail? And if the answer was no, then you can go ahead and skip the rest. Now, in parallel, we also worked with partners at the Housing Authority and at DHS to try to take a step back and think a little bit more expansively about what else might we do to improve the speed with which applications are processed, and indeed, even after the application is improved, how might we make changes that make it easier, simpler, quicker to go from an approved application to actually getting a unit to call your own. And so this was a more broad discovery process. And one of the first things that we did with help from the Department of Human Services was hire 5 people who currently hold vouchers to be what we call resident researchers to join the team. And they helped us narrow the scope from everything related to the process to a couple of key questions to really focus on improving the experience of applying for and then having a voucher. And from there, they helped us determine the research methods to use and who to speak to. We ended up using interviews, focus groups, and observation to just understand how the process was functioning. And then we brought the resident researchers, the staff from our organizations, plus the folks we engaged through research to all come together and synthesize all the material, all the research material into a set of findings that hopefully were better calibrated and more on point for the input of not just those of us who have experience working on the program, but also all the people who have experience engaging with the program, whether they're residents, landlords, case managers, or others. And from there, after generating findings, developed a set of co-created recommendations that the Housing Authority and the Department of Human Services could consider for next steps after the form revision. And so that report is now available. It identifies 6 findings and makes 6 recommendations. And leadership at the agencies are considering what to do as next steps, either with our team or on their own. And so that's a bit of a synopsis of the work that we've done from beginning to end.
That's great. Thank you, Ryan. And for those curious, we can include a copy of that report that Ryan mentioned, or we will include a copy of the report Ryan mentioned in our show notes. Sam, is there anything you want to add to Ryan's sort of description of the work you did to revise the Housing Choice Voucher Program? I'm also curious to hear from both of you of the impact that you're seeing come from this work.
Yeah, I'd add in the second piece that Ryan touched on, and so a lot of this discovery work and the work of bringing resident researchers into the process uh, was oriented around the customer experience, as Ryan said, and thinking about what voucher holders would need in terms of a system, a set of information, a process that's going to fit their needs best, and that's not just the people working in it, but also the landlords, the case managers, everybody who's really a stakeholder in this process. There was one thing that we knew from the beginning was a kind of a ripe opportunity to improve that, and kind of like the obvious place to start. So Ryan and his colleagues in our civic design team, while they were engaging in this discovery work and this understanding of the system as a whole, started to focus work on the vouchers application itself, which started out, I think, at even the most basic thing that you could imagine, which is how many pages are in the application. And it turned out that probably took a month or two to even figure out exactly what is the application that you need to fill out for a voucher, how many components of it are there, who needs to fill out what. And so we couldn't even actually, I kept on asking the team for like talking points or notes for the city administrator to say of like, how many pages is this? And they'd be like, it depends how you count it. It could be 150, it could be 60, it could be 200. There's all of these different modules, whether you're getting it from the federal government or the local government, whether you qualify for it because you're a client of our Department of Behavioral Health. We don't know. It's a lot though, and we know we can make it better. And so the team, as part of their work of mapping out how you receive a voucher, started to work through this application and think about the things in it that are truly necessary for the functioning of the program, things that are required by the federal government, things that we really need to know from the applicants or the landlords, but really try to get to the core of what is really needed in the application, and then figure out ways that we can orient the application around how it's going to be the easiest for residents to fill out and for case managers to fill out. So some of the impact of that has been that we took an application and we were able to essentially split it up into different components so that some residents were answering 40% less questions in what they were trying to apply. In other ways, we were able to take a form that's supposed to be accessible to kind of any resident, that was written, I believe, at like an 11th or 12th grade and at some points postgraduate reading level. And we were able to bring it down so that the reading level, the typical reading level that's required to understand the form, is somewhere in the 4th grade to 6th grade range, depending on the part of it. And so no matter whether you've been to grad school or you have a PhD or not, or whether you have lesser levels of education, if you can simplify the language and make things easier, that's often going to result in a better experience. And so that's been a huge part of what the team did is continuing on both those tracks, where we know that the application could use some work, and so working on that while we're thinking about these bigger systematic things that we can do to change it. And so we're very proud to say that form launched on February 1st. On time, and is being used by the Department of Human Services and the Housing Authority. And we've been getting some great feedback on it. A lot of positive feedback, a lot of constructive feedback, and it's been awesome to see it roll out.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Well, my last question for you both is, do you think your work can be scaled? A lot of our listeners are local government leaders, and cities are probably, the district is unique. It's almost more like a state than a city. Do you think your work can be scaled? And
we would like that to be true, not just like a
state. Fully agree, fully on board with DC statehood.
Yep.
But do you think this work could be scaled to other smaller localities, counties that want to do similar work to what the lab is doing?
Let me provide the design perspective, which is that one of the nice things about a civic design toolkit is that you don't need to have that title or be steeped in years and years of experience and expertise to start to apply those methods. And so at the level of wanting to ask good questions to find really meaningful problems, and then getting out there and testing something and maybe failing but doing better, that's something that anyone who works in government can take and try to build into their day. The amount that you learn from just going and seeing how a service plays out, or spending an hour sitting somewhere like a center where folks go to interact with the government, and just noting what happens, is almost always going to generate an idea about, like, well, maybe we could do this better, or maybe we could do that better. I really want to learn this. I really want to learn that. And that's something that I think needs very little in the way of infrastructure or blessing to do and to scale. I'll leave the question about building institutions and offices to Sam, since that's what he's done.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer it with an emphatic yes. The district government has around 30,000 employees because it does function as a state and a city and a school district and a county all at the same time. So we're fairly large for a city government, but small for a state government. But our team is about 13 people right now. So that's like a fraction of 0.1%, I think, if I have like the math right. And it's really a question of how, as a government of any size, you want to think about your resources. If you want to think about how do I do things the same way government has traditionally operated, then by all means continue doing it in the same way that's more traditional. But if you want to take a small amount of your resources and devote it to doing things a little bit differently, and trying to really actively say we're going to learn from our experiences. We're also going to put out our failures there in what we've done, and be honest about that with residents and the community as a whole, but really in the spirit of generating better outcomes in the long run. If you're going to take that approach, it really doesn't take a lot of resources on the scale of a government. And a lot of the tools can be done by 1 or 2 or 3 people. It's really finding the people who are really engaged and want to do that in your government. And a lot of times governments have those folks that already exist, just kind of haven't tapped into that skill set. So folks like for example, we have staff members on our team who had come into district government at different routes, but have wound up building up the skill sets to be civic designers. We have other folks that have come from different government backgrounds, but have learned to apply it to local government. And so I do think it's something that's scalable, but it is a choice, and we're very, very thankful that the leaders in DC have made that choice.
Awesome. Thank you both. And sadly, we're at time. Though there are many, many, many more questions I would love to ask you too. Ryan, Sam, thank you for joining us on this episode of GovLove. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Very proud to have been a part of one of my favorite named podcast series I've ever heard of Between Two Interns.
Likewise. Thank you, Danno.
Yeah. Thank you both. All right. Well, that ends our episode for today. And thanks so much again to our guests, Ryan Flynn and Sam Quinney from the lab at DC, and to Katie Gann at the lab for introducing me to Ryan and Sam. And thank you all for listening to this unique and special episode of GovLove. If you enjoyed today's episode, please do leave us a rating and review on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. If you have any follow-ups, you can reach out to us at elgl.org/govlove, or on social media platforms as GovLove Podcast. Thanks for listening, and be well.